this module, we're going to talk about how sentences are composed. We'll talk about the components of sentences, how they must agree to some extent. We'll work on what clauses are, different types of clauses, and how to string them together. And we'll also talk about articles, which are sort of the underdogs of sentences. So the most basic sentence structure must consist of both a subject, which can be a noun like a person or an object. It can be a pronoun such as he or she, or a proper name such as your own name, for example, or Dr. Smith. And a verb, so that subject needs to be doing something. And the subject and the verb must agree. So that means they must agree both in tense and in terms of being singular and plural. And we'll talk about that more in the next module on verbs. And a very common and the most basic sentence structure is pretty much subject, verb, object. So the subject does something to the object or with the object. And every sentence is made up of at least one clause. So a single clause would be the subject, verb, object, or just subject, verb composition. It's basically the unit of grammatical organization just below the sentence. So we do also need a subject and a verb, but not all clauses are complete sentences. An example of a clause and a sentence that is complete would be the university funds research. The university is our subject, funds is the verb, research, the object. So there are two types of clauses out there. One is a dependent clause. So take a second and think about what a dependent clause is. This little image here might give you some sense of a dependent clause's necessity to have something else. So dependent clause is not a complete sentence. It requires an independent clause in order to be one. And usually that's because of how it's set up. And this usually consists of a first word in the sentence that is a trigger word that generates the expectation for more information or for a follow-up. So examples would be, although water demand has risen. The word although implies that we're going to say something that might be surprising based on the fact that the demand for water has risen. When the creek dries up. When the creek dries up, what? Something must happen. There must be some kind of impact because of the word when. If you are searching for samples, then what? You must do this, or you should be careful of this. We're setting up the expectation with that word if, that we're going to add some more information or a warning, a caveat, something like that. Conversely, independent clauses are complete sentences. So they don't start with a word that creates the premise for more information. And to turn any of those dependent clauses from the previous slide into independent clauses, all we have to do is cross out the first word. Water demand has risen. That is a viable short sentence. The creek dries up. You are searching for samples. All of these are very simple independent clauses as well as complete sentences. So you want to be aware when you're writing that you're not using a word like since or because or although, however, something like that, setting up the expectation for more information and then only having one clause there. That means you're going to either need to cross out the first word or add in a second clause. So there are, in the world, simple sentences and very complex sentences. As we discussed, one clause can constitute a sentence. This is the most simple sentence possible. Cows drink water. We only have 3 words here. We could also actually just have cows drink. That would be a viable sentence, although a little bit vague. You could also have a very complex sentence made up of multiple clauses. Cows drink water, which is usually provided to them in troughs by ranchers, who must constantly weigh the water demands of livestock against those of their crops and families. We're throwing a lot of information in here. And in general, we want to try in our writing to have a combination of complex sentences and simple sentences. So if we only have simple sentences, the reading level would be considered to be very elementary for maybe kids or young adults, for example, and it would also read very choppily, and you'd have to have a ton of sentences to get your point across. If we only had very complex sentences, on the other hand, it would be hard for the reader to process what you're talking about if all of your sentences go on for almost a paragraph or longer. So in general, there are 3 types of sentences. The simple sentence, as we identified, compound, which means 2 independent clauses joined together by a word like and or but, a transition word. And then there's complex sentences like the second cow sentence example I showed you, that are made up of 1 independent clause, at least 1 dependent clause, maybe more clauses in addition, and joined by various types of words and punctuation. So really want to strive to have a a diversity of these types of sentences to make your writing engaging, understandable, and smooth. There are also two types of sentences that are actually not sentences at all that we need to be aware of. So the first is the run-on, which we'll go into in greater detail in the next slide. This is when we are joining together several independent clauses without any punctuation or transition words like and or but. And finally, we also have the fragment, which is a dependent clause or phrase that does not make sense by itself. So a dependent clause is a fragment. You could also have a sentence that is not necessarily a dependent clause, but just is not organized properly, or is very, very short, like one word, for example, would be considered a fragment. And you'll find this in creative writing, poetry, fiction, but it's not appropriate in academic writing. So run-on sentences, just to show you a couple examples of what this might look like. An example of a run-on sentence would be, Professor Malik instructed the students to work on their thesis. The thesis is the pinnacle of their academic careers. It is therefore incredibly important. So this is a run-on sentence. It's also what's called a comma splice, which we'll talk about more in the punctuation module, where we're just throwing a comma in between two clauses here without any word in between the clauses to join them. If it were a semicolon, that would be okay, because semicolons allow you to create two different independent clauses without joining them with the word. But in this case, we need a word in here. So to correct it, we could cross out the thesis and say which is the pinnacle of their academic career, and therefore incredibly important to make it not a run-on sentence. An example of a fragment, a report. However, the report said. Both of those are not complete sentences. A report is just a subject, there's no verb. And the second one is a dependent clause. We're starting with however. And the report said, and then not telling anyone what the report actually said. So beware for these types of sentences in your papers. So now we're going to shift to articles, which are crucial parts of composing sentences that are often difficult when we're learning English as a second language, because very many languages have different rules regarding articles. Some words don't require articles at all in perhaps Urdu or other languages that you speak. And in English, the words might require articles, and the type that they require vary considerably. So articles are one of four types of what we call determiners. So articles are they, the, a, an. Some is also considered an article, although it's also considered a quantifier. Then we have possessives. This is to indicate that the object belongs to somebody. So his, theirs, ours. And then there's demonstratives, this, that, those. That can be paired with a noun, or it can stand in for the noun if it's referenced in a previous sentence. So if you said, the ball is red, this is a good ball. This, in that case, is shorthand for ball. And quantifiers. How many are there? Many, some, a lot, a few. We're going to talk about articles because this is the trickiest of the four determiners and the most problematic often for English as a second language learning. Excuse me. So learning articles can be tricky, and there are two rules to remember. One is that every noun that is singular and countable needs a determiner. So a hat, for example, is countable. We can count hats. Versus weather is a noun, but you can't count weather. You can't say we have 5 weathers. So anything that is singular and countable. And then plural nouns and nouns that cannot be counted do not need determiners or articles. But if they are referring to something specific, you can use determiners or articles. So I know that sounds a little bit confusing. We're going to ground this with some examples. So how to determine first, is a noun countable? Countable is something that literally can be counted. A sample, a beaker, a pen are all examples. A plant can be counted. Then there's some nouns that are uncountable. So this is something, a person, or an object, or someone, a person that cannot be counted. Evidence, time, work, vegetation, for example. We can't say that there are 7 times. Well, you could say there are times in terms of like across the world, there are different time zones. And we'll get to how some nouns actually can be countable or uncountable. But you wouldn't say there are 7 times. There are 7 vegetations. And then just to show this example down here, the plant is countable. a singular countable noun, but when we make it plural, plants, we do not need a determiner or article anymore because it is plural. However, we can use one if we're referring to specific plants. If you could say, the plants in my garden are doing very well because there's lots of rain this season. But if we were referring to plants more broadly, we could say plants derive their energy from sunlight, then we are talking about general plants and do not need an article or determiner. So some examples of uncountable nouns: abstract concepts tend to be uncountable. Academic disciplines, we cannot say there are 7 engineerings, so engineering is not a countable noun. Liquids and gases, materials, phenomenon, and weather, for example, wind or rain. These are uncountable nouns that do not require determiners. There are nouns that sometimes require determiners and sometimes do not. I know this can be confusing. So for example, paper as a material is not really countable. When we talk about paper as something that is produced or just as a broad material, we do not need a quantifier for it. If we said paper is made from trees, does not need an article, for example. But if we're talking about papers as in the paper that you're writing for a class or a report, then it is countable. You can say, I've written 5 papers about my research topic. So you have to always consider the context, and you can literally just pull up your hands and try to count whatever noun is in question, and if you can't count it, then it does not require an article. If you can, then it does. So then the next question you'll have to ask yourself is, does it need a definite or an indefinite article? So definite articles are the, which refers to something specific, versus indefinite, a and an, which refers to something vague or general. So questions to ask yourself: do you and your reader know what the noun refers to? So you both have to know. If you know and your reader doesn't know about this hat in question, for example, then you can use an indefinite article like a or an. But if you both know the hat you're talking about, you can say the hat. Is the noun in question specific? So are you talking about something broadly, or are you zeroing in on a very specific object? And is the noun in question hypothetical? So maybe you're giving an example of something that could or would happen in a study that you're conducting. If it's hypothetical, then you want to use an indefinite article. If it's not and it's concrete, like if you're talking about reporting results that have already come to be, then you would want definite articles. So take a minute and read these over, pause the presentation, and test your skill here. So try to fill in the blanks with definite or indefinite articles. The options are the, a, or an. And just to be clear, a you have before consonants, sounds, and an you have before vowel sounds. So take a second, pause the presentation, and do your best, and we'll review. So hopefully you had a chance to fill in the blanks here. I am conducting an interview. Interview starts with a vowel sound, and we're not saying that it's a specific interview. We're probably, because in the speaker's mind here, they know what the interview is, but perhaps to the listener or the reader on the other end, they don't know about this interview yet. So we're using an indefinite article. With the manager, so there's only one manager, let's assume, at a wastewater treatment plant. So if there were multiple managers, we could say a, but if there's only one, we would say the. So we're going to assume it was one. If you got this part wrong, that's understandable because context is obviously important. At a wastewater treatment plant. Again, this could go either way. If you are talking to someone in your town and there's only one wastewater treatment plant, then you could say the. But if you're talking to a friend in Arizona, for example, or London, and you're just saying that it is a wastewater treatment plant, they don't know which one you're talking about, so you would use indefinite article. The interview will take approximately 60 minutes. So at this point now, both you and the speaker and the reader know about the interview, so we can use a definite article. If we said an interview will take approximately 60 minutes, that would be sort of an odd statement. We're not just trying to describe how interviews go generally, we're trying to anticipate how this interview will go. Another sentence, Islamabad is the capital of Pakistan. Countries have one capital, so we know it has to be a definite article. We're only talking about one thing. The next sentence, we used a clear glass bottle. So a clear starts with a consonant sound, so we use a. And there are many clear glass bottles out there. So unless we're gesturing toward a bottle in our hand that both our reader and speaker know about, we want an indefinite article to store the water sample in question. So we're assuming there's only one water sample because we're saying in question here. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have questions about this, you can reach out after the lecture. And a versus and, just to review again, it's not just that we put and before vowels. We also put it before vowel sounds. So where this might get confusing is a word like hour, which starts with an H, and there's a lot of H words like this, but the sound we make when we say it starts with a vowel. Hour. It starts with an O-W essentially, phonetically. So that requires un. And another example is with acronyms. So oftentimes we have an acronym where the sound or the name of the letter starts with a vowel sound, and so we need un versus a. An example would be un-HMI official suggested adding more user-friendly technology. Un-LED light. Because L, even though it's a consonant, we say it with EL essentially, phonetically. So just sound it out. That's usually the easiest way to do it. So take a second again, pause this presentation, and try to just get your A's and ands down, fill in the blanks, and then we'll review in the next slide. So here we go. It's a little confusing because both of our first words here start with U, but they have different sounds. Un-uprising, but a university. University starts with a Y phonetically. A uniform versus un-onion. A lead weight, un-LED display, as I talked about earlier. A clear sign, an ominous sign. A market, an MRI machine. So really be careful with acronyms because we use a lot of those in the sciences, and it's very common for the name of a letter to start with a vowel sound even though it actually starts with a consonant, which can be misleading. So this is it for articles and clauses and how we compose basic sentence structure. The rest of the readings in this module should help give you a better idea and more practice with these concepts. And as usual, contact me if you have questions.